Hello, everyone. Today we're going to continue looking at the relationship between church and state. The last lesson focused on the impact that the church had on kind of lay society, particularly intellectual society. So hopefully you did the activity on Thomas Aquinas and the existence of God. And that piece kind of showcases the influence that the church has on everyday society. So everything from universities to lay culture to theology, obviously it's religious, but also philosophy. We see the influence of church everywhere. Now, um, even though the church has a very strong influence on people, because that is like the connecting um, identity for most of these Europeans, right? Being Catholic at this moment, the state is also a very important institution, and this lesson focuses on that. So this is from chapter 10. Some of this information will be in your book. You have a few kind of quick discussion boards. I looked at a few sources from the book. And we'll look at two countries, specifically England and the Holy Roman Empire. Kingdoms, I should say, right? They're not countries. But then we really want to stress the importance of the church. So we're going to see the development of kingdoms, but also the growth of the church. So we're going to start off by looking at England. So the goals for today is really look at how in the High Middle Ages, around the year 1000, European kings really came into their own. Prior to that, you have these kind of loose confederations of many states almost, right? Many kingdoms. And you have the development of the vassal-lord relationship, which the book talks about. But you don't really have strong monarchs. By the about 1100s, around that period, you begin to see the emergence, just depending on what location you're talking about, but you begin to see the emergence of strong kings. So we're going to look at that. In addition, we're going to examine the centralization of the church, because the church becomes its own kingdom, if you will, in the Middle Ages. So we'll talk about that, and you'll have a few activities related to that. And then lastly, kind of like the overall theme here is to address who has more power. Is it the church or is it the state? This is not only an intellectual question, but definitely a political question of the era, where each institution felt that they were above the other. So the church felt that they were above the king or the state, and the state felt that they were above the church. So these are not just discussions that we have as historians. These were real battles that cost people their lives. So let's look at first at England. So England is an interesting story because our relationship with England as a country, we have kind of close ties to it, which is why we focus so much on them. But the rise of the English monarch, you have people like Alfred, and the book talks about the early history, but it's really with William the Conqueror, who takes over England, and then he creates a very important book, the Doomsday book, that kind of takes a great look at what he just conquered, basically, right? It looks at all the different kingdoms and what resources they have, and it's really intended to take political control of this new land that he conquered. And in the context of the Middle Ages, this is quite innovative because nobody had thought to do this prior to that. He did it maybe more for tax purposes, right? He needed to collect revenue from these new territories that were now his. But it really kind of sets the tone as we move forward, because now these kings are moving away from being warriors like Charlemagne, but rather administrators, like say a president today, right? They're not out. The president can send people to war, but he's not going to be out there fighting himself, right? Whereas in Charlemagne's age, Charlemagne was out there fighting and declaring war. By the year 1000, kings are more just like rulers, if you will, right? They're there to control, to I guess a better word might be administrators. Like a president of a country or president of a company or something like that. So William the Conqueror kind of sets that tone. There's a few kind of lineage issues happening there, and again the book talks about that. But it's Henry II that comes in, and he begins to transform England into something that's much more recognizable to us today. So he's part of what's called the Plantagenet dynasty. Understand that most of these people are French. They see themselves as French, probably, more than English. But again, these identities are not really important because they never saw themselves as French or English, right? These concepts don't come up until much, much later. But he establishes the royal treasury, the exchequer. I think actually his Henry I establishes that. But definitely takes it over because it keeps track of the money. An important thing that Henry II implements are the royal courts. The royal courts are significant because he's able to send his people around this territory, which is both parts of France, places like Aquitaine, Normandy, but also England. And these courts travel throughout the throughout the kingdom, and administer his justice, basically. And this is important because you begin to see this idea that every kingdom has somewhat of a universal royal system. And it kind of creates stability, whereas before every region had its own kind of quirky laws. By this period, you see these kind of universal, not quite universal, but it's kind of getting there, laws throughout the kingdom. He also implements the common law, which is what I just talked about, right? It just, again, depends. But for the most part, he does implement these laws that are applicable in Normandy, but also in Wales, right? In different parts of this territory. And this is important because it kind of brings this kingdom closer together as almost like a country, right? Today, we have these kind of debates, right? State laws versus federal laws and so forth. Well, these ideas are not quite permanent quite yet, but we do see this movement where the king wants to implement his rules upon everybody. So this is a major advancement for this particular era. And then the book also talks about, and hopefully I'll be able to post a documentary about the subject too, is the relationship between church and state. As I mentioned at the beginning, much of the battles of this era are between these two institutions. And in the early Middle Ages, about 800 to about the year 1000, a lot of times kings selected who they wanted as priests, and particularly bishops. They put somebody in that seat. And today we probably would not allow that because we got an idea of separation of church and state. In the Middle Ages, there is no clear distinction. You know, the church is the state and the state is the church to some extent, right? At least they feel like they have influence over it. So in the example of Thomas Becket, you see how Henry II and Thomas Becket fight each other because Thomas Becket believed in the idea that the state should have no impact on church issues. So even though Henry II more or less put him in his position as Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket didn't reciprocate that favor to say, okay, I'll do whatever you want, and said instead, we are two separate institutions. You have no say in church matters. And this would be a fight to the death, and what ends up happening is that Henry II sends some troops to Canterbury, and they kind of chop off his skull and scoop out his brains and kill Thomas Becket. So this is a major event just because we see that fight between church and state. After Henry II and that whole issue that happens with church, he actually has problems with his family too. This is what makes the Middle Ages so interesting, that just because they're blood doesn't mean you have to like them. And most of his sons didn't like him. Two of them died, and the only ones left were Richard Lionheart and King John. And King John was, after Richard Lionheart dies in a battle in France, King John takes over. And King John was quite a horrible ruler. He's what we would call an absolute ruler. He believes that everything he says is correct. He did a lot of horrible things to people. For example, he took away property from one of his nobles, and his noble ended up dying. And the wife was supposed to take over the noble, but King John kidnapped the son and imprisoned him and just tortured him until he died. So he also, slept around with many of the noble's wives and things like that. So he was quite a horrible person. And again, the book talks very briefly about King John. I mean, it was so bad that the English nobles, particularly around France, wanted the French monarchy to take over the property. They actually helped the French monarchy. So in this kind of battle, we have the development of what's called a Magna Carta. And I want you to take a few minutes. I want you to read it. It's in your book. It's called the Magna Carta. It's in chapter 10 under the English section. And read the one from the book. Don't go somewhere else and read some other source, because the one from the book is very short. And I want you to look at some of the laws. Choose two of them. And I want you to tell me what it says. So read the law. Don't just rewrite the law, but tell me what this law is telling us. What's the purpose of it? So interpret it rather than just reword it. And then I want you to think about it. Is this document, is it enlightening in the sense that, is it progressive, that it's getting this out of this kind of dark medieval world where the king is all powerful and advocating that, different groups in society have rights? Or do you think it's barbaric because it's doing the opposite? It's actually sending us back to the Middle Ages. So again, read any two laws, interpret it, and tell me why you think it's one or the other, whether it's barbaric or enlightening. And then lastly, I want you to give me your 2 cents after you read the document. It's a real quick, short piece, all right? So it should only take a few minutes. But do you think that this document is the beginning of democratic values? It's saying, people should have rights that are not given by a king, but rather by this document called Magna Carta. Now, we will revisit the Magna Carta weeks from now when we look at England during the Renaissance and that kind of later period during the Age of Absolutism. So let's continue by looking at this other kingdom called the Holy Roman Empire. There's a bit of a joke, funny to academics maybe. It was an SNL joke where this one character once said, I think, and I quote, "Speak amongst yourself, the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire." And, everybody laughed in the audience, but I don't know if they knew why they were laughing. So we're going to take that joke and show you why this is such a contradictory type of statement, right? The Holy Roman Empire. So first, let's look at the Holy Roman Empire. What makes the Holy Roman Empire? And this is from your book, I believe, and it's on page 274. And you see this kind of large piece of territory, right? It's almost, no, not quite, but the closest it's been to the size of when Charlemagne had it. He's probably the Holy Roman Emperor. And, it contains a lot of land from Germany and a few other territories, and some of these islands, and all the way to southern Italy. The only part of territory that's not included is the central part called, this is the Papal Monarchy, which still exists, not in that size anymore though. So again, what makes this term, Holy Roman Empire, funny, right? What's the contradiction in it? So there's a few things, and this comes from the book, right? The book talks about how the Holy Roman emperors were never really emperors, right? In a sense of the Roman type of emperor, such as Julius Caesar's and Augustus and so forth. And I think they actually never use the word emperor either. But nevertheless, here what we see is that you have monarchs, but for the most part, every region kind of controls itself, right? They're independent territories, even though they elect emperor. So they're not really a strong monarch like in other places, such as we just kind of looked at England. And as I mentioned a minute ago, right, it's just a loose confederation of many kingdoms, if you will. But there's the attempt to unify it, particularly with Frederick II, who tried to bring everything together, particularly this region, which is very profitable. But eventually he fails at this attempt, and the nobility fights back and implements the Habsburgs so they can have a weak monarch, right? And basically every noble can do what they want. That was the intent of having a weak king. And then again, the problem part with the holy part in this Holy Roman Empire statement is that there's nothing holy about the Holy Roman Empire, right? The monarchs, particularly Frederick I and Frederick II, were in constant war with the church. If anything, they wanted to take over this papal territory and make it part of this larger territory, but eventually they fell. It's Frederick II is a very interesting monarch because of just the type of person that he was. The book talks briefly about this, but he was educated and lived a good part of his life over here in Sicily, and he had a very strong relationship with Muslim people. And this is significant because Frederick was probably one of the most educated monarchs of that era. So it's interesting to see the type of person that he was. And I want you to actually take a few minutes, and like we just did before when we were looking at the Magna Carta, I want you to look at this primary source. It's on page 275, and it's called The Deeds of Emperor Frederick II. Him and the church never got along, and once he died, he was buried behind some mountains, and they believed that he was going to come back and take over what he thought was rightfully his. The church, I think, labeled him the Antichrist. That's how much they hated each other during this period. So definitely Frederick II was a bit of a character. So I want you to read this small section, and it should take you only maybe 2 minutes to read. It's very short. And give me an example of just one of the type of experiments that he was doing. And what do you take of this, right? What do you make of all, the type of person that he was? Do you think he's crazy? Do you think he was a madman, or do you think he's a man of science? I mean, look at the method also that he implements in doing some of these experiments. So again, the Middle Ages is associated with this sense of idiocy and backwardness and superstition. Yet here we see Frederick II doing some experiments that are quite intriguing, right? At least for the Middle Ages. So read it, look at it, address the questions, and answer the questions, and see what you think of it. All right. So I think we'll kind of stop it there. This just kind of summarizes what I already kind of stated, right? That he was, spent a lot of time in Sicily, wanted to take over Italy, and most of his time was dedicated to fighting with the church. He actually goes on crusade, on the Sixth Crusade, and he negotiates with the Muslims. Again, that relationship with the Muslims in Sicily helped him out when he goes on crusade to Jerusalem, where he's actually able to take over Jerusalem, which is something that had not been done since the First Crusade. And the only reason he did it was to piss off the church. So it just kind of goes to show the, that very negative relationship he had with this, with the Pope at that time. All right. Let's look at the last example, the last monarchy of this period. Again, we're looking at the relationship between the church and the state. So both with England and Germany, or Holy Roman Empire, we talked about that very, that very negative relationship that they had with each other, with Becket, and then the whole, the Pope and Frederick II. So now we're going to focus more on the papal monarchy. As I think I stated at the beginning of this lecture, was that in the Middle Ages, the church was very important to a lot of people's lives, right? Particularly in every kind of section of Western Europe, where the unifying identity was Christianity. So yeah, you might have some people that might be French, and even then that was subdivided into different nobilities and estates and things like that. One thing that kind of unified all of Europe was this Christian identity. So the church did play a very important role in many aspects of people's lives, politically, socially, economically, and again, these last couple of weeks we've been kind of looking at that, of how the church has its tentacles everywhere, right? It has that influence everywhere, and we saw it with sexuality and with marriage and so forth. So we kind of have to talk about this institution and see what impact it has in this high medieval period. So in the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church was a very political institution. And unlike today, where maybe we have somewhat of a separation between church and state, in the Middle Ages, that just didn't make sense to anybody. Why would you have a separation? And you have kings who are, not kings, but you have bishops who are running countries, basically, or running territories, and that would have seemed very natural. The church has its rules, but people were doing whatever they essentially wanted, priests and bishops and so forth. So it's definitely a free-for-all of what's happening in this medieval institution in this particular period. So there's a lot of corruption in this period. We find that particularly in Rome, the office for Pope was for sale. Today we might think that we select people who are hopefully educated, but also very theological, know the rules of the church and so forth. In the Middle Ages, it's a political office where some of the most important Roman families would essentially elect a pope. And they put him in office. And the popes were not too concerned with spirituality. They were more concerned with helping the people who got him into office. Here's just an example of John the 12th. He becomes pope at 18 years old, and his focus was just on growing the papal territory, growing the papal monarchy, not on spirituality, but getting more land for the church. I understand that people were giving the church land too, so they were becoming wealthy, and it was a very wealthy institution. We find that some bishops and other church officials were vassals. They were part of nobility, so if you enter into this vassal-lord relationship with a lord, with a king or some other noble, you had certain duties to fulfill. And a lot of them had to do with military, right? That kind of defines the Middle Ages, is that this vassal-lord relationship was built on this concept of military duty to your lord. Another important thing is, as I mentioned a minute ago, right, that the Pope and a lot of offices within the church were very political instead of spiritual. So we find that when it came to certain offices, so let's say you're the Archbishop of Canterbury or some bishop in Paris, a lot of times these offices were being sold off to important people. This is a word called what they call the simony, right? When they sold these offices for profit, which goes against the kind of principles of the church. So, by the High Middle Ages, we had the rule of Saint Benedict, who implemented this monastic order that focused on getting away from materialism and so forth. And that worked for some places, but the church became very wealthy. People were giving land and money, and leaving. Once they passed away, leaving all these things to them, and getting all these resources, they begin to become somewhat corrupt. And the church encouraged this. We find many sources that talk about how the church would go talk to wealthy people and advocate for them to leave them their resources. And in the Middle Ages, that was the ultimate goal. We do find a lot of wealth, at least well-off people leave the church either money or land. So it did make it very corrupt. And then in the about the 10th century, you see the implementation of what's called the Cluny reforms. And this is a major shift that happens in France, where the state, here being the French monarch, the French king, basically allowed monasteries to be separate from state control. Understand that a lot of times kings wanted to tax the church because it was a lot of revenue. Again, they're very wealthy. Today, I think we more or less kind of have that separation of church and state, where churches are tax exempt, right? In the Middle Ages, that wasn't very clear. So if you had a church that was very wealthy in my kingdom, I'm going to tax you, right? I want some of that money because they're always doing something with it, going to war or something. So the Cluny reforms kind of implemented, at least started that idea that the church should be separate from the state, at least from their control. And they implemented, going back to these kind of basic rules of focusing on manuscripts, supporting the community, that type of stuff, right? So these reforms became very, very significant because it sets the tone for reform in the church. And it was the Pope, particularly Pope Gregory, who implemented some of these major reforms. One thing that he did, you can find this on page 280, was to eliminate the idea of lay investiture, that idea that a secular official can select a church official into a particular office in their kingdom. So again, if there's a opening of a bishop in Paris, we had kings put those people in power, as we saw with Thomas Becket over there in England, right, Canterbury. There's a sense that there's allegiance more to the king than there is to the Pope, or at least to the church. So lay investiture essentially tried to eliminate that. Didn't completely go away. The king still had some influence, some say in these things, but for the most part, lay investiture, which was implemented by Gregory the Great, Pope Gregory the Seventh, was able to have more influence in selecting these different positions throughout, Europe. Another very, and then he did other reforms. There's a section called the Gregorian Revolution that talks about some of these reforms. Really, one of the major ones, and you read this, was that the Pope saw himself supreme to the state, right? I think it says like the church never errs and the Pope never makes a mistake or something like that. So we see that major shift happening where the king sees himself as all powerful. Another important person is Innocent III, and he implements this concept called the interdict. I'll talk about that in a minute. But what makes Innocent significant is that, again, he continues that separation between church and state, where he creates basically a court system that kind of governs the church. Kind of like today in the military, right? I think the military has its own court, and they kind of settle their issues through their court system. It's the same kind of idea here, where everything that, let's say a bishop committed some crime in Paris, well, the church would take that investigation over. The state would not be involved. And this is a very radical shift because if these crimes were committed in these different localities where it's owned by somebody else, where you have a French monarch, the state felt like they should have a say. And here the church is saying, no, this is because it happened to one of our people. We're going to take care of it. And Innocent III, and the reading talks about this, really is the height of the power of the of the Pope, of all the popes, right? This is when the church is most powerful in its history, where the church sees itself above the state. So if the state did not agree with this idea, the church implemented what's called the interdict, where basically they didn't allow their priests or anybody else to give the sacraments to anybody. And understand that this is a very religious society, so if nobody gets their sacraments and they die, they feel like they're going to go to hell, or if they don't confess their sins, they feel like they're not going to be supported by God. So by implementing this interdict, they hope to kind of hold sway over the population so they can influence their monarch or their noble, their lord, to come back to the church and agree with whatever the church, whatever problem they have with the church. So the interdict played a very important role in that. I think today it's like an embargo. I think we do that with places like Iran, right? We put pressure on the population, hoping that the population turns on its leader and then come and negotiate with us. So, we've been starving North Korea forever and they haven't budged yet. So, we're not sure if it'll work or not. And back then, there are some examples where it worked here and there, but it's that spiritual power that they're trying to have over its population. Again, because everybody's Christian, there's a sense that you need these rituals and you need these, you need the body of Christ, and you need the church to bless your wedding and to bury you and so forth, right? Because the afterlife is so much longer than the present. So, Innocent III was probably at the height of his power. The church was at the height of his power when he was in office. And these are very political office by the Middle Ages. There is a pope, his name is Celestine V, who was pope, I think about the 1280s. And basically the church was going through some struggle, and they wanted to find the holiest man on earth to become pope. And they find this guy. He was already old. He lived down some mountains up in Italy, and they selected him as pope. And he came in, he's like, okay, well, I'll be Pope. Again, this is supposed to be the holiest man on earth, right? And he doesn't know what to do. Eventually, I think some noble from southern Italy controls him. He's like a puppet to this noble. And he gets arrested and he ends up dying in some prison. But it just kind of goes to show that he was so incompetent. Yes, he was holy. Yes, he was a good Christian. But you need to know how to wield power. And that's what these popes did, right? Innocent III was a lawyer by trade, and they know how to have influence, and a real political influence over people. And the holiest man on earth, Celestine V, he ended up advocating, just didn't know how to run this administration at this time. The church, it's not, you're not just running some little church, right, in Rome. You're running all these positions throughout Europe, and if you don't know how to be an administrator, you're going to fail, and that's what we see with Celestine V. Whereas Innocent, again, he's a lawyer, they're administrators, they know how to run these institutions. So it's very hard to be pope at this time. You could be as Christian as you want, but if you're not a good administrator, it serves no purpose. So we see how the church is trying to regain control from the state, and that's really significant of what's happening in this particular period. So just to quickly conclude this, we do see the beginning of strong monarchies emerge. So even though we feel like the Middle Ages, you have all these powerful kings, for the most part, just depending on the region, some are more powerful than others. France, for example, and England probably being the best example, eventually fails much later. But they're all coming into their own. Places like Spain, places like France, the Holy Roman Empire, which eventually kind of fails. They tried to have a strong monarchy, but it failed. Second, we see how the church really institutes itself in people's lives. Everything you did, whether work, play, whatever, right? It revolved around the church in some shape or form. Birthdays, names, birth, death, marriage, your entire life revolved around the church. So we see, even though it doesn't control as a state, all of Europe, it does have that influence over most of Europe. And we see this kind of battle between church and state without a very kind of clear winner. This is a battle that continues on pretty much until the Reformation, and it's being fought at different times, just depending on the situation. But for the most part, there isn't quite a clear winner. But most historians have noted that during the reign of Pope Innocent III, the church was at its height, was the most powerful it will ever become. And after that, it slowly declines. Obviously, the Reformation kind of hurt it quite significantly. So we'll stop it there and hopefully do those activities. And I guess we'll just end it there. Have a good day.